Rambam University, but also Master University, because I mentioned it because of Matt. I'm very happy to have a chance to invite him to speak, and he's going to talk about John the Baptist and Jesus, an ancient dialogue of disciples. Do you want to give the handouts?
Yeah, you just pass them around this way and this way. I think I have one for myself here.
Do you?
I have to make sure. Yes. Yeah, no. Okay.
You have one?
Yeah. Okay. Let me simply begin by saying that there are 5 women in my life to whom I can't say no. They are my wife and my 4 daughters. Michal is number 6 on that list. And that is the reason I'm happy to be here. I will talk, I think, for about 25 minutes. I will read my talk so that I can be more or less sure it will fit into about 25 minutes. I won't read any of the texts on the handout. I will just mention them as I go along and hope you can follow, and that way the talk will fit into about 25 minutes. So that's the plan. Okay. One notion, which I suspect we will hear invoked a fair amount over the next 2 days, is what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. Searching to explain this idea in class many years ago, I dubbed it the rule of the Martian. This rule states that hatred and insistence on difference is likely to be greatest between 2 groups between which a Martian would have the greatest difficulty discriminating. This principle was also stated in his characteristically evocative manner by Jonathan Z. Smith, number 1 on your handout. Perhaps because this notion has been invoked so often, it sometimes seems as if there is specific real merit in insisting that this dynamic did not apply in some explicit case. I can think in particular of the relationship between Rabbinite and Karaite Jews, once understood as very similar, but also having a wall of differences in calendar and food laws separating them, which made marriages between Karaites and Rabbinites impossible. A wall which has now been torn down by the reality of relationships unveiled in the documents of the Cairo Geniza. Furthermore, since the Karaite-Rabbinite dispute was often taken as a model for the attitudes of the Qumranites towards other ancient Jews and vice versa, the statements in Qumran sources denouncing others outside their group and prohibiting almost all contact with them were taken as representing reality. Following up on the newer appreciation of Karaite-Rabbinite ties, I began to wonder whether Qumran texts should be taken as reflecting reality and not understood as normative, as we now recognize as the nature of so many rabbinic sources, with the daily reality of life in Qumran not so nearly separated by a chasm from the rest of the ancient Jewish world in the land of Israel, as the written sources demand. For my paper setting out all these reflections, see the reference in the bibliography section of the handout. For the purposes of this presentation, however, I would like to invoke the narcissism of small differences, or the rule of the Martian, in its more old-fashioned meaning, as a means for helping recover the silent voice of a group about whom we hear almost only from the side of those who felt the necessity of consistently downgrading them and subordinating them to their own benefit. Okay, enough of introduction. The Gospels are our most important and extensive sources on John the Baptist, where he appeared as a major character in the story of Jesus, of course the principal subject of the Gospels. Indeed, of all the uncertainties concerning the career of Jesus that have proven the bane of scholars who have attempted to write the quest for the historical Jesus, perhaps one fact known with a very high degree of certainty was that Jesus was baptized by John. Note as one very small example of Jesus' relationship to John, that even at the very end of his career, after the resurrection, Jesus still repeated John's message of repentance bringing forgiveness of sins in Luke 24:47. At the same time, virtually every time John appeared in the Gospels, the authors took the trouble to insist on his subordination to Jesus. This tendency reached its pinnacle in Christian art, of which maybe the most extreme expression is the Grunewald-Issenheim altarpiece, painted by Nikolaus of Hagenau and Matthias Grunwald in 1512-16, from the monastery of St. Anthony in Isenheim, the altarpiece now in the museum in Colmar, number 2 on your handout, which I thank Asher for having reproduced in color. Contrary to all historical plausibility of the narrative, as John was long dead by then, John was represented in the altarpiece as present at the crucifixion of Jesus. He is pointing to Jesus and citing the verse from John 3:30, where John himself announced to his disciples that he, Jesus, is destined to grow while he, John, must diminish. It's in Latin. It's kind of hard to read on the reproduction, but it's there. This overwhelming necessity to subordinate John was almost sufficient in itself to suggest that the reason for this persistent demotion was the need of believers in Jesus to address and combat followers of John who, well after John's death, continued to believe in his special role in the scenario of redemption. Perhaps we even consider John to be the Messiah. These followers were then involved in a relationship of the narcissism of small differences with those who believed in Jesus. John, on this understanding, was not just someone who attracted a crowd that came for his baptism. He had disciples who constitute a movement of some sort, too close for comfort for the followers of Jesus. And of course, this is supported by the Gospels, where John, already in jail, sent his disciples to Jesus to find out just who Jesus was. Of course, as this story is told in the Gospels, the facts discovered by these disciples of John reinforce the ultimate status of Jesus and stress, "Happy is the man who does not find me a stumbling block." It's in Matthew and in Luke. I think I've just quoted the Matthew version as number 3 on your handout. The conclusion that John had followers who continued to believe in his special role in the scenario of salvation is reinforced by scattered remarks in later ancient Christian literature, especially in the Pseudo-Clementines, denigrating Jesus but praising John, scattered remarks to which I would ascribe the highest importance since they go against the grain of the dominant, almost violent Christian voice subordinating John to Jesus. Now, if the John-Jesus relationship was awkward for followers of Jesus, and they resolved it by constant insistence on John's subordination, it seems plausible to posit that this relationship was also awkward for the followers of John, and to wonder how they dealt with this problematic situation from their perspective. Can we restore the lost voices of John's disciples, almost totally drowned out in the sources written by men who believed that Jesus was destined to flourish while John could diminish? This is one of the objectives of a larger project on John, in which I am now engaged. For the purposes of this conference, I would like to present one example of how one might go about achieving this goal. For my purposes today, I would like to focus on the one almost unique set of passages about John in the Gospels in which he is not subordinated to Jesus. The sources that talk about the notion brooded about that Jesus was the resurrected John, Mark 6, Matthew 14, Luke 9, 4a through c on your list of handout. In this case, there was no need to demote John, as the readers of the Gospels knew that John was dead and that Jesus was not the resurrected John. If any Gospel reader were in doubt, this point will be made clear in the sequel, when in response to the request of his disciples to clarify who Jesus was and his relationship to John, Elijah, and the prophets, Jesus revealed the messianic secret in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So, according to Mark, people were saying about Jesus that he was John the Baptist raised again to life, and that was why he had these miraculous powers. Herod, who knew that he had beheaded John, nevertheless believed this. According to Matthew, Herod heard reports about Jesus. Herod then said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist who has been raised to life," and that is why he had these miraculous powers. This actually is the strongest statement in the Gospels, that Herod believed these reports. From among the 3 possibilities talked about, that Jesus was John, Elijah, or a prophet, Herod confirmed that Jesus was John risen. According to Luke, Herod did not know what to make of the reports he heard that Jesus was John the Baptist raised again to life, because he knew that he had beheaded John himself. Herod was therefore puzzled. Now, just a brief background. Belief in physical resurrection of the dead was one of the most paradoxical points of faith held by at least some, if not many, Jews. Celsus denounced this belief as an implausible hope of worms. He asserted that the more reasonable Christians and Jews do not hold this belief, which shows its utter repulsiveness. Origin against Celsus 5:14. On the other hand, Celsus's Jew insisted on this belief and on the special nature of the first person to be resurrected, who will benefit from extraordinary powers. Number 5 on your handout. Therefore, if Jesus really was the resurrected John, this would help explain why he was able to perform the miracles he did, which is precisely what Mark and Matthew said in the passages that we looked at before, 4a and 4b. Now, the belief that Jesus was the risen John has been ignored in at least some of the scholarly discussions I've seen. Joan Taylor's book on John, which I mentioned in the bibliography section of the handout, she is my victim for almost everything with which I disagree, and I cite her when I need to find somebody with whom I disagree. She waffles on the significance of this tradition and tries to explain it away as caused by the fact that people did not necessarily know just when John had been executed, and therefore they confused Jesus and John. Now, I think this is apologetic nonsense, because, first, this is not what the text says. Jesus was viewed as the risen John, and this was the source of his power. Popular belief was fully aware that John was dead. It was central to the popular belief that he had been resurrected and therefore had the power to perform the miracles attributed to Jesus. As I noted, Herod shared this belief, and Herod certainly knew that John was dead, as he had ordered him executed. Luke, who was a careful historian, stated that Herod was puzzled because he knew that he had executed John. In any case, all of this idea that somehow Jesus was the risen John was the result of confusion because people did not know just when John had been executed, I think is hopelessly wrong. But I want to ask a different question. Who were these people who thought that Jesus might be the risen John? Who were the source of the reports to Herod that Jesus was the risen John, reports which Herod supposedly believed to be true? Were they the followers of John? John's disciples had buried John, that's in Mark 6 and paralleled in Matthew 14, so they definitely knew that he was dead. But were they the ones who broadcast that John had risen again as Jesus? Did these followers of John also believe that John had been raised from the dead, was still active on earth, at least for some time, and that Jesus was nothing more than the risen John? Were they the ones who claimed that even Herod believed that this was the case? I think this is plausible, but to move this conclusion beyond plausibility requires fitting this conclusion into context, determining what purpose this belief might have served for the followers of John and how it fit into their spectrum of beliefs. As discussed above in detail, the John-Jesus relationship was awkward for believers in Jesus. The Gospels have sensitized us to its awkwardness in their obsessive concern at numerous critical places to carry out damage control, to minimize John's role, and to insist that John himself knew and declared that his role was only subsidiary to that of Jesus. If so, as I suggested above, the John-Jesus relationship was also awkward for the followers of John. And I propose that one way they dealt with this dilemma was to argue that Jesus was no more than the risen John. This argument complements other scattered pieces in our evidence. There is testimony to overlapping communities of believers in John and Jesus at the end of the book of Acts, number 6 on your handout. And from the perspective of the true believers in Jesus, those that only believed in John needed to be taught the difference between belief in John and belief in Jesus in order to then receive the benefits of belief in Jesus. But, at least I wonder, what if this account of overlapping communities had been told by believers in John? This story in Acts is not the only evidence that there were those who continued to believe in John after his execution. The Pseudo-Clementine recognitions contain brief statements about disciples of John. They separated themselves off from the community, i.e. they were an identifiable group denounced, as is usual in literature of this sort, as schismatics, who believed that John was the Messiah. number 8 on your handout of sources. According to the Syriac version of this text, these disciples believed that John was alive, but was in hiding. Again, number 8 on your sources. Furthermore, in their dispute with the disciples of Jesus, these disciples of John insisted that John was the Messiah and Jesus was not. To support this claim, they cited Matthew 11:11, Luke 7:28, where Jesus declared that there has never appeared on earth a mother's son greater than John the Baptist. For them, this was proof that Jesus himself recognized that John was the greatest of the prophets and therefore had to be the Messiah. Number 7 on your handouts. I want to suggest that it was precisely in order to counter this sort of argument that Jesus in Matthew 11 and Luke 7, going back to number 3 on your handout, insisted to the disciples of John, "Happy is the man who does not find me." A stumbling block. As Ephraim noted in his commentary on the Diatessaron, when John sent his disciples to inquire concerning the stature of Jesus, it was not because, God forbid, he had any doubt on the matter, but it was because he wanted Jesus to confirm the things John had said about him, namely that Jesus was greater than John. John was directing the minds of his disciples towards the Lord. When Jesus concluded, "Happy is the man who does not find me a stumbling block," according to Ephraim, through these words Jesus gave a sure pledge to the disciples of John, lest they be scandalized on his account. Number 9. That is, lest their belief in the status of John bring them to deny the supreme role of Jesus as Christ nailed to the cross was a stumbling block to Jews, according to Paul. Now, in a dispute of disciples of this sort, one cannot have too many arguments. One does not suffice. As noted at the outset, the Gospels missed no chance to demote John and assert that John was only a forerunner of a greater one to come, and that this greater one was Jesus. If it is now clear that the disciples of John maintained that John was the Messiah and Jesus was not, I want to suggest that they did not limit themselves to the argument in Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions 160 discussed a moment ago, where Jesus testified that John was the greatest of the prophets. I want to propose that these disciples of John offered at least one additional argument in favor of their conclusion, exalting John and demoting Jesus. I therefore suggest that it was John's followers who announced that he had risen from the dead and then was active again on earth in the person of Jesus. They were the ones who broadcast the message that Jesus was the risen John, and even Herod, who had executed John, believed this, and if Herod, who had executed John, believed this, then this conclusion was beyond doubt. In this way, they coped with the challenge of the John-Jesus relationship, claiming that John was the real Redeemer of the world and the beneficiary of the extraordinary miracle of resurrection and of the attendant powers, while Jesus was nothing more than the resurrected John. John's followers were therefore doing to Jesus what Jesus' followers had done to John, raising the stature of the man they believed to be the Savior to perhaps the highest level, as the pattern and leader in proving that God could resurrect the dead, and demoting his rival by turning that very rival into proof that John had been resurrected, and that this, in fact, was the reason that rival could perform all sorts of miracles. I think this is quite neat. Your rivals become proof of the stature of the figure in whom you believe, and an argument in favor of the person in whom you believe against that rival. This is perceiving the other in a remarkably effective polemical manner. If I can indulge my imagination a bit more in conclusion, and suggest another point that John's disciples may have made in their favor, I conclude with a passage from the Mandean Ginza, a text from the 8th century, which is far too late and far too much in the realm of uncertainty to be invoked as serious evidence for the more ancient dispute between disciples on which I have focused. Nevertheless, this text represents what I would like to imagine the disciples of John would have said about Jesus in an analogous manner to what the Grunewald Isenheim papers did to John. It's Ginza 2, 151 to 152, the last source on your batch of handouts, and just for the sake of convenience, I'll read that and conclude. In those days a child shall be born who will receive the name of Joanna. He will be the son of old Zachariah, who shall receive this child in his old age, even at the age of 100. His mother, Anishbai, that's what they did to Elizabeth, advanced in years, shall conceive him, and shall bring forth her child. When Johanna is a man, faith shall repose in his heart. He shall come to the Jordan, and shall baptize for 42 years, before Nebo shall clothe himself with flesh and come into the world. I don't quite know what that means. While Johanna lives in Jerusalem, gaining say over Jordan and baptizing him, Jesus Christ shall come to him, shall humble himself, shall receive the baptism of Johanna, and shall become wise with the wisdom of Johanna. But then shall he corrupt the sayings of Johanna, pervert the baptism of Jordan, distort the words of truth, and preach fraud and malice throughout all the world. This is a really nasty way of perceiving the other. Thank you very much.
And now we open the floor. Oh, good timing. We open the floor for questions.
What is the last text? What is
It's the Ginza, which is a Mandean text.
Mandean text.
It's a Mandean text, and it's filled with statements about John. The historical, it's from the 8th century. As I say, I wouldn't dare claim that it has any relevance or place in a discussion that goes back to the 1st or 2nd century CE. But it represents, at least in my imagination, the sort of things that one group might have said about the other group, and to accuse Jesus of having received all his wisdom from John and then having perverted it and preached fraud and malice, I think represents this group of disciples in a most extreme way.
So thank you very much. If I ask now perhaps a silly question, it's just because I'm a little bit tired, but I'm not too sure. Would it perhaps be possible to go a little step further? And I'm not sure. If we have this saying, John the Baptist has been raised to life, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Where does that's why come from? I don't exactly understand the relation between coming back to life in a bodily way and the conclusion that that's why he's the one who has miraculous powers.
Okay.
And perhaps a final thing, does this perhaps also say a word about their own idea about John the Baptist? Sorry if perhaps I have missed something.
No. Let me make two comments. First of all, I brought the passage from Celsus's Jew, from the beginning of Origins Against Celsus, to show that belief in resurrection and in the possibility of bodily resurrection was a very important element and was the ultimate proof of the power of God. Now, Celsus's Jew also makes clear that this person who has been resurrected and will be the pattern and leader will live forever. And as someone who has been the beneficiary of this extraordinary miracle, I think one can show sufficient evidence that the beneficiary of this important miracle can also perform miracles himself. This is material that I put together that I thought was too much to introduce as part of this presentation. I hope to talk about it in other places and other times. And I think among the evidence for the notion that the person who has been resurrected has been the beneficiary of a miracle and can therefore perform extraordinary miracles himself, this comes together as a kind of package.
May I add a final sentence? So, does this mean that for the followers of John the Baptist, perhaps that they say, but for our being followers of John the Baptist, it's not important that John was somebody. John himself was not somebody who did miracles.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
John himself. One of the differences.
So, right. For them, this is not important, but for the others, it may.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. One of the important differences between John and Jesus that we know is that John does not perform these miracles while Jesus does. But the resurrected John as they want to understand it. He is performing miracles, and I think that's, I deliberately concluded by talking about how neat I find this argument as polemics. You take your opponent, you take the miracles he performs, and you turn them into proof of the figure in which you believe. And you demote him in the process. And that, I think, is quite neat.
Thanks so much for this paper. I think this was the perfect start of this conference. We have all this stuff in the intersection of this opposite positions here at the table. I'm just struck by the text from the Pseudo-Clementines.
Okay.
Because I can follow the argument, of course, but when one thing is typical for Pseudo-Clementines is a Christian text which isn't that Christian at all, especially in the notion of Jesus as Christ, as Messiah.
Right.
And so I find it quite stunning and striking that the other group, so John and his disciples, are those who believe in the Messiah.
Okay.
What to make about this turning of roles?
One of the questions that I would like to duck, at least for a while, no, I'm quite serious, is how is it that this material is in the Pseudo-Clementines? And I think you're effectively asking the question that I would like to duck. And one of the reasons I would like to duck it, at least for the moment, is because of the what I consider to be the very indeterminate nature of scholarship on the Pseudo-Clementines. When was it written? Where was it written? These are all issues that are still being debated, issues on which I confess I only know a little bit and I have to learn more, and I have to make up my mind. And after that point comes, maybe soon I hope, I might be able to understand how and why it is that this material just happens to appear there. But I agree that that is an important issue that needs to be resolved. But it is there.
Yeah, right.
That we can't deny. However it got to be there, and whatever purpose it served. Now, I will just add one more thing. The passage from Recognitions 160 that I quoted is a passage in which the Pseudo-Clementine authors talk about the different Jewish groups. They mention Sadducees, then they mention Pharisees, and then they mention the disciples of John. Now, of course, when the Pseudo-Clementine authors note that John's followers believed him to be the Messiah, and that even Jesus was testifying to this, they go on to refute it. I don't need the refutation that much for my purposes. So again, how and why these texts fit into their immediate context and larger context is something I need to think about. If any of you have an answer, I'd be very pleased.
Katel?
Yeah, I'm just, this is a very interesting idea, what you are suggesting. And I'm just thinking, like, this is purely polemical, and this must be purely polemical. They cannot have believed that Jesus was the resurrected John. And more than that, how could anyone have, except many people who have never heard about these guys before, never met them in any case, how could one believe that this was the resurrected John? I mean, here in Mark, it's Herod who talks, and he says, this is John whom I beheaded, raised from the dead. But Herod had met John. So there is a problem here. I mean, because in all the resurrection stories that we have, in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament, it is always the same person that comes back to life.
Yeah.
This is important. It's the same person. So here we have a story of somebody who would be risen from the dead and would be a different person. This is very weird.
No, it's not. It's not a different person. It is the person that's performing these miracles, who is known as Jesus, is really nothing more than the resurrected John. And look, believing in resurrection is not the easiest thing to believe.
It's already an issue.
What?
It's already an issue.
It's already an issue. And it seems to me that if you're willing to take that jump, lots of other stuff can come along with it without any problem. Now, you do have, I think, a point that I would like to address, because at least in the gospel tradition, it's important that the people who knew Jesus when he was alive recognize him as resurrected. Okay? And I think that is effectively what they are saying when Herod, who knows that he beheaded John, believes that this is the resurrected John. This is an analogous kind of identification, confirmation to the way the resurrected Jesus is confirmed as having been resurrected in the Gospels. So I think that's Herod's role. Now, had Herod seen Jesus? Did Herod know that this really looked like John whom he had executed? Who knows? I mean, we're dealing in a world where we can't answer those sorts of questions.
So I'm going to take my role as a chair and interact a question here. You're using a lot of the word really thought, did he know. You're talking about history or literature?
The story still has to make sense. You know what I mean?
I understand.
That's in this way.
It's not a clear cut.
But if it's, there we go, and we start. So I'm really asking a question. So if Herod is presented as if he's supposed, this is literature, if he's supposed to recognize him, or then it's not a problem, right? So because it's an integral part of the
story.
plan. Yes.
Yeah. Look, all of this is taking place in a world where it's much closer to literature than history, and where the story has a dynamic and an inner logic of its own that has to be fully played out. We're being told the story from one side, and I'm trying to turn that story inside out and trying to tell it from the other side. But it's still a story in the end.
I'm going to get Matt, and then I'm going to climb. Yes, I think it's an important aspect, but yes, Matt.
So just a brief note on this recognition. Luke has this famous story on the road to Emmaus, where they don't recognize the resurrected Jesus. So it seems to me there's maybe, within this worldview, there's a possibility that resurrection entails some sort of new identity or new appearance. Some transformation.
But the resurrected Jesus claims to be Jesus.
Yeah.
The resurrected Lazarus claims to be Lazarus. That's what I mean. There is nobody who is resurrecting and claims to be someone else. That's the point. That's where the story doesn't completely make sense.
That's why it's fraud and misrepresentation.
That's why they get upset. Right.
So my question that I've been really wanting to ask, the argument based on Matthew 11:11, is fantastic, and it makes really good sense. I'm using Jesus' words against him to demote him.
Right.
It's perfect. The other argument you're bringing up is very different logic. I'm trying to figure out how they fit together by saying Jesus is actually a new John or resurrected John. That's not really, from John's disciples' point of view, that's not a demotion, that's a promotion, right? It's a demotion from Jesus' disciples' point of view.
It's a demotion, it's a promotion of John at Jesus' expenses, as I would like to understand it. But I'd like to address your other, the point with which you began.
Okay.
I don't see any need for two polemical arguments to fit together.
Okay.
You can never have too many of them. And for that, I'm sorry. No. I'm thinking of something else which is making me smile, and I don't want to start talking about it. The point is that polemical arguments are not expected to fit together. They are responses to specific situations, and therefore I think it is not. They are not the sorts of thing that A has to fit together with B. A does its own thing in its own way, and then B goes off in some other direction in its own way, and they don't need to cohere in any important way. They only cohere to the extent that they manage to make your point at the expense of the other side.
That's a fair point. Thanks.
Hi.
Thank you. It's a very intriguing idea. I want to ask, usually in resurrection stories, the body itself is a proof.
Yeah.
The same body that comes from the grave or resurrect. Now, this is a different body. So the proof of, I don't know, heavenly power or something like that is connected to the idea that the same body that was dead is now resurrected.
Right.
Now, we have some kind of a different thing here. I don't know how to translate it to English, but it's some kind of Gilgul Neshamot.
I'm not sure if Gilgul Neshamot.
I don't know exactly, but it's not a bodily thing. It's like a soul that the soul of John moved into the body of Jesus or something like that. But
my question was similar to that. Do we have an evolving notion of resurrection here? And the fact that you have people who don't recognize Jesus as, and they have other people who are claiming that they are the ones. So maybe there's an evolving notion.
Okay, one second. The principal work that we all need to have a look at, and that I have looked at not as deeply as I should, is Carolyn Bynum's book on the resurrection of the body. And there, Carolyn Walker Bynum, her second big book on the resurrection of the body. And there, I think we do see evolving notions of resurrection. I think this is not a problem from that perspective. Now, she deals with evidence that begins where she begins where I end. She does not. She works. She's a medievalist, so she works into material with which she is familiar and shows different notions of physical resurrection. I want to take that approach and apply it also to the earlier material. Okay? But that's part of the paper that I said I wasn't giving. I'm going to save it for some other place.
I think we have 2 more minutes for short questions, if anyone has it, or a comment. Nathan?
Yeah, thanks. It's really fascinating. And if I don't make sense right now, it's because I'm half asleep. Are you suggesting? Yes, thanks. Your paper's so good. I'm as awake as I could be. Are you suggesting that this was? I mean, if this did actually come from John's circle, was it purely polemical, and a cynical way of one-upping the Jesus movement, or would you rather argue that they believed it?
Well, one second. Come on. How we can determine intentions 2,000 years ago in a story is very, very hard. And did they really believe this, or was this just polemical? I don't know how we can answer that question. How do we have tools to even begin to answer that question? What I think we can say is that in whatever way they believed it, I think that this notion that Jesus was the resurrected John originated in the circles of John the Baptist. Whether they believed it or they just were using it polemically, I don't know, or maybe both. And then this tradition was their way of dealing with the fact that they perceived Jesus and his followers as competitors. And as I said already twice, so I won't repeat it again, it was a neat way of dealing with this awkward situation.
Would it matter if they already had interacted with Jesus? If something like what you see in John's Gospel, where the circles overlap for a while, and they would that?
Sure. You have these overlapping communities, and it is in the context of these overlapping communities that at least some people in them feel the need to distinguish between them as hard as possible. It's not an accident that I began with that nice quote from Jonathan Z. Smith.
Just very briefly, I felt influenced by the Ginza text at the end to then read that back and to view it as polemical, but the texts themselves, co-optation doesn't always have to be polemical, and as you were presenting them, I think I felt that these were acts of co-optation in order to sort of ride on Jesus' coattails or tunic tails or whatever is the appropriate term. That you know, this is the one who won the day, and we're still going to connect our guy to him in some sense. So it seems to me you could leave open the range of uses, rhetorical uses that this could have had in terms of asserting authority and ensuring that your guy isn't lost in the whole scheme of things as the story continues to be told. And it could range anywhere from sort of co-optation, appropriation, standing in the shadow, to polemics. But I think you've got a lot of options for where you could push it.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, but I would respond only that given what seems to me to be the overwhelming need in the Gospels to diminish John,
it seems more of a response.
It seems more of a response. I agree. In other circumstances, perhaps, but here, where you have the Gospel so determined to diminish John, I'm reluctant to read a friendlier version of these texts.
Thank you very much.